July 1944. The air hangs heavy with the smell of burned coral and cordite. Saipan's jagged cliffs cast long shadows over a battlefield that once was a quiet Pacific paradise. Waves crash below, but their rhythm is lost beneath distant explosions. The ground is littered with shattered helmets, broken rifles, and silent bodies, American and Japanese alike. A young American infantryman, barely in his 20s, steps cautiously through a narrow ravine. Sweat mixes with volcanic dust on his skin. His hands tremble as he grips his rifle tighter. All around him, whispers of the enemy echo from hidden caves. Then he sees her, a Japanese woman, thin, exhausted, her clothes torn and covered in ash. She clutches his uniform sleeve with desperate strength. Her eyes are wide, reflecting terror deeper than the war itself. She refuses to let go. She speaks rapidly in Japanese, voice cracking, begging or warning. He cannot tell. Shellfire erupts somewhere beyond the cliff. The soldier tries to pull away, but her fingers tighten until her knuckles turn white. This is not an act of violence. It is something more human. Something war was never meant to destroy. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had reached a violent turning point. The United States, advancing island by island, pressed closer to the Japanese homeland. The fall of Saipan, a small island in the Mariana chain, became a strategic necessity. From its airfields, American B-29 bombers could strike Tokyo itself, a threat the empire could not allow. Japan's military doctrine was built upon the ancient warrior code of Bushido, promising honor in death over the shame of surrender. Soldiers were taught from their earliest training, better to die than be taken alive. This ideology did not remain only on the battlefield. It was drilled into civilians, women, the elderly, even children, propaganda films, and school. Lessons warned that Americans were monsters, torturers, violators, devourers of flesh. To be captured meant not just defeat, but a fate worse than death. Women in the empire were raised as guardians of virtue and family, expected to protect the home and preserve the purity of the nation. Their loyalty to the emperor was spiritual, unconditional. Even though most had little direct connection to the military, wartime propaganda cast them as final defenders of Japan's dignity. In the final months of the war, it was common to see women carrying hand grenades, knives, or simply stones, anything to resist capture. On Saipan, tens of thousands of civilians lived among hardened soldiers in fortified caves and hidden ravines. When the U.S. Marines landed in June 1944, the island became a chaotic battlefield. Lines between soldier and civilian disappeared under artillery fire and close-quarters combat. Japanese commanders ordered mass suicides rather than surrender. Families jumped from cliffs into the sea, convinced it was salvation. Amid this terror, scattered groups of civilians attempted to flee American patrols. Terrified, starving, dehydrated. To the U.S. troops, these women were not trained combatants, but frightened survivors of a collapsing empire. Still, they could not ignore the threat. Women, too, had been seen pulling hidden weapons or triggering deadly ambushes. Human connection, impossible yet necessary, flickered through the brutality. American soldiers, young and far from home, found themselves face to face with civilians indoctrinated to fear them more than death. Every encounter carried uncertainty. A hand reaching out could be begging for help or concealing a grenade pin. This harrowing environment is where our true story begins. A moment when an American soldier and a Japanese woman collided not as enemies, but as two terrified human beings trapped in a war far larger than either of them understood. As the battle dragged on through July 1944, Saipan's caves became desperate shelters. families huddled together in darkness, surviving on rainwater and scraps. Many women had lost husbands, brothers, and fathers in the early days of the American invasion. Now they clung to children, neighbors, or anyone still living, as the roar of battles circled them like an approaching storm. American patrols combed through ravines and cliffs, searching for hidden fighters. Their orders were clear: secure the area, but distinguish civilians from combatants whenever possible. It was easier said than done. Marines had already seen women rushing forward with concealed explosives. Others emerged waving white cloths, only to dive off cliffs when approached, convinced they were saving their honor. The Geneva Convention offered clear rules for the treatment of prisoners of war. But the Pacific Theater existed in a legal and moral gray zone. Japan refused to recognize surrender. Many Japanese soldiers chose suicide rather than captivity. The U.S., in turn, struggled to decide how to treat civilians who rejected rescue. Fear stained every decision. Still, as civilians began giving themselves up, exhausted, injured, starving, the U.S. forces established search and holding zones. Here, women were gathered, given water and basic medical aid, and escorted to makeshift facilities. These were not traditional POW camps like those in Europe. They were improvised humanitarian centers designed to protect and stabilize those who had survived the nightmare. It was within this fragile system that rare but powerful encounters occurred. Reports from Marine units speak of women who collapsed in relief when offered food. Others clung to corpsmen, believing them to be the only path to safety. Some unable to accept the end of the war they had been promised victory in, fought against being separated from American soldiers who rescued them from burning caves or collapsing cliffs. Psychologists would later describe this as a mixture of shock, trauma, and attachment under extreme survival pressure. To suddenly rely on the very people they were taught to fear as monsters, it shattered the world they knew. One such case stands out. A Japanese woman found alone among the rocks, dehydrated, trembling, unable to walk on her own. When a young American soldier reached out to help her, she seized him with both hands. She refused to release him even for a moment. Her world had collapsed, and this stranger, this enemy, was now her only lifeline. The soldier tried to understand her words. He tried to reassure her. But communication failed. Only her grip, desperate, unbreakable, spoke clearly. Two lives, bound by fear, fate, and a war neither asked for. And this is where the deeper angles of their story emerge. A. The American soldier. Training, culture, emotional shock. The young American soldier who found himself clutched by trembling hands had been trained for a different kind of enemy. In boot camp, instructors drilled into recruits an image of Japanese soldiers as fearless, cunning, and relentlessly hostile. Posters back home depicted them as shadows with bayonets, or insects needing extermination. He had been prepared for ambushes, banzai charges, and fanatical resistance, not a terrified woman begging wordlessly for him not to leave. He carried his rifle not only as a weapon, but as a shield against panic. Each step across Saipan's shattered terrain was survival. Yet nothing had prepared him for this moment, when the war's simplified slogans dissolved into humanity's complexity. His emotions, fear, confusion, sympathy, collided in a split-second decision that could mean life or death, kill or help, push her away or hold her steady. He chose the latter. B. The Japanese woman. Indoctrination, fear. Loyalty, her world had ended in fire. Raised under Japan's imperial rule, she had worshipped the emperor as a living god. Her teachers had recited, Americans are demons who will destroy your soul. Even as shortages deepened and fear crept into every home, faith in ultimate Japanese victory never wavered. No honest surrender existed in their reality, because surrender itself was a lie. When American shells shattered her cave shelter, she lost family, safety, and every certainty she had ever known. Forced into daylight with explosions tearing the sky apart, she faced only terror. And then she saw him. Not a demon, but a soldier extending a hand instead of a weapon. Yet trauma clung to her like smoke. She could not trust him. She could not release him. He became both her captor and her protector, the last pillar left standing in her collapsing universe. C. Bushido versus Geneva Convention. Moral doctrines in collision Japan. And the United States waged war not only with bullets, but with philosophies. Bushido, the way of the warrior, demanded loyalty unto death. To be captured was to lose honor permanently. This belief infected both soldiers and civilians, turning surrender into spiritual obliteration. Meanwhile, the United States adhered to the Geneva Convention's framework, imperfect in practice, but rooted in the conviction that prisoners deserved protection. The Marines advancing across Saipan carried orders to save civilians where possible. But hesitation could mean disaster. So when a woman gripped a soldier's arm and would not let go, two worlds collided. One where she believed death awaited if she released him. One where he was sworn to keep her safe. Even if he feared her, her refusal was not aggression. It was the last act of faith she could perform, clinging to life in the only way she understood. Their hands locked, fear against duty. A moment where war's ideologies narrowed into two trembling humans. D. Psychological trauma and survival instinct. The human mind, under extreme stress, clings to the simplest path toward survival. The Japanese woman's world had collapsed violently in hours. Explosions, smoke, collapsed tunnels, lost family members. Trauma experts now describe such reactions as attachment in crisis, the instinct to latch onto the nearest source of perceived safety, no matter how improbable. For her, the American soldier became a lifeline against a nightmare that seemed endless. Every movement around her, the echo of boots, the clatter of weapons, distant artillery, triggered a fear response that tightened her grip on him. Releasing him felt like stepping unprotected back into death. For the soldier, trauma manifested differently. He was trained to move forward, to clear ground, to stay alert. Having someone clutch him, dependent, shaking, forced him to confront emotions he had buried since the first day he witnessed death. Orders told him to search for survivors. Instinct screamed that vulnerability meant danger. Yet, he did not push her away. Both were prisoners, not of each other, but of circumstances too overwhelming for reason. Language barrier and emotional escalation. Every word she spoke was lost in translation. His replies, calm, halting English, may as well have been silence. Two people surrounded by thousands, yet utterly alone in communication. She tried to explain with gestures, voice rising in panic any time he shifted his weight. He could feel her nails pressing through his sleeve. Fear so strong it turned into strength. Without language, trust became physical. Her grip begging him not to leave. His free hand carefully lifted in reassurance. Eyes searching eyes for meaning, neither could provide. This barrier escalated emotions. The inability to understand why she clung to him created tension among the patrol. Teammates called out, urging caution, urging speed. She responded by clutching tighter, convinced they would separate her, leaving her defenseless among strangers. In war, silence often causes more fear than gunfire. F. Rare mercy in a brutal war. The Pacific Theater is remembered for its brutality. Mass suicides, no prisoner combat, unwillingness to surrender. Yet hidden among the horror are accounts of mercy. WW2. Marines carrying elderly Japanese women to medical tents. 2. Corpsmen treating infants found alone in caves. WWII. Soldiers protecting civilians who surrendered into their arms. These moments rarely made headlines. Compassion was not a weapon of war, but it did exist, quietly. One life at a time. This woman and this soldier became one such story. At that ravine on Saipan, amid shattered coral and deafening shell fire, a decision approached. The soldier's squad needed to move. The woman refused to let go. Fear spread through both sides, tension like a wire pulled to breaking. One wrong move, and compassion could turn instantly into tragedy. Every breath, every heartbeat tightened the moment toward a single irreversible turning point. Saipan, July 7, 1944. Operation Forager had nearly run its brutal course. American forces were sweeping the island's final pockets of resistance, moving through a ravine near Marpy Point, the northern tip where cliffs fell sharply into the Pacific below. The young soldier, part of a Marine patrol, was clearing a path strewn with volcanic debris. His squad knew the danger well. Caves still hid snipers, wounded soldiers sometimes feigned death, and civilians occasionally chose suicide over surrender. Every sound demanded attention. Every shadow felt alive. A medic signaled to him. A figure lay half-hidden behind a fractured coral boulder. Cautiously he approached. It was a woman. Alone, disoriented, her hair matted with dirt and dried blood. As he knelt to check if she could walk, her eyes snapped open. In a single motion of terror and pleading, she flung herself at him. Her fingers closed around his sleeve, then his wrist. Her breath came in panicked gasps. She shook her head violently as if refusing some unseen command. The Marine tried to reassure her, scanning for hidden threats. But she clung tighter, pulling herself upright only by using his arm for support. Nearby, other Marines raised their voices, shouting for caution. "Watch her hands! She holding anything? Keep your weapon up!" Fear rippled through the patrol. They had seen grenades planted beneath clothes. They had seen women lure soldiers close before detonating explosives. In this war, compassion could be fatal, but he saw only desperation. Her grip wasn't an attack. It was a plea. He lowered his rifle slightly and shifted his stance to help her stand. She pressed against him, trembling uncontrollably. When he tried to take a step forward, she nearly fell, finding balance only by clutching harder. Removing her would cause harm. Leaving her meant abandoning a civilian to die alone. The squad leader, surveying the scene, signaled to keep moving. They couldn't stay exposed. Sniper fire remained a threat in the cliffs nearby. The Marine attempted to loosen her hands gently. She whimpered, a raw sound of pure fear, and her grip turned unbreakable. He paused. Around them, the war did not pause with him. Gunfire echoed from a ridge. The ground shuddered with distant mortar blasts. Her voice finally rose, fast, pleading Japanese phrases he could not understand. But one thing was unmistakable. She believed that if she let go, she would never see safety again. Real accounts from Saipan confirm such moments. Women who believed that clinging to a single soldier was their only hope of survival. Fear distorted every decision into life or death. The Marine looked into her eyes. He didn't know her name. She didn't know his, yet their lives were suddenly bound together, and the next decision could break either one. The patrol's pace quickened. They needed to reach a designated clearing where wounded civilians were being gathered. Every second spent stationary risked drawing fire. The squad leader gestured sharply. "Move!" But the woman's grip only tightened. When the Marine took a step, She stumbled with him. He tried to peel her fingers away, but she cried out, a sound carrying terror so deep that even his battle-hardened instincts faltered. She repeated one phrase again and again through tears. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the intent. Don't leave me. Her body shook, not from injury, but from dread of separation. For her, this soldier was the fragile thread tying her to life. If he stepped away, the world behind her, of caves, fire, and death, would swallow her again. The squad grew tense. A fellow Marine whispered urgently, we can't drag her all the way. What if she's hiding something? Another chimed in, what if she panics and gives away our position? A decision had to be made. Fast. The young Marine lifted his rifle into one hand and used the other to motion toward his squad. He would handle this. Reluctantly, they accepted, spreading out a few meters ahead, eyes fixed on every ridge and shadow. He turned back to her, slowing his breathing as if to lend her calm. He pointed toward the direction of safety. She hesitated. Her gaze flicked between his face and the distant trees. Then, trembling, she made a single step, still holding his sleeve, refusing space. This was no longer about fear of the Americans. It was fear of being alone. War had taught her that separation meant death. Perhaps she had seen families torn apart in an instant. Perhaps she had lost everyone she loved in the caves behind her. She refused to lose the last living soul who had shown her anything but violence. Marine records from Saipan recount similar encounters. One report from the 2nd Marine Division wrote, some civilians, upon contact, would cling to our men and panic at any attempt to separate them. They seemed convinced that safety only existed within arm's reach of the first man they met. In that ravine, surrounded by echoes of a dying battle, the young soldier made a silent promise that transcended orders. He gently shifted her grip upward, placing her hand over his shoulder so she could walk more securely beside him. She exhaled, not relief, but a fragile surrender to hope. Step by step, they advanced. The squad leader glanced back, acknowledging the resolve in his Marine's eyes. No one spoke further. The war continued around them, but for a moment, something different took root. Humanity refusing to be erased. The clearing neared. Medics waited. Safety was close, but her hand did not loosen. Not yet. Not until she believed she was truly saved. The Battle of Saipan officially ended on July 9, 1944. But for many who survived, including the woman and the young Marine, the war would continue in their minds long after the guns fell silent. She was escorted to a makeshift civilian collection point near the newly secured Charan-Kanoa airfield, a place where hundreds of Japanese non-combatants were gathered under American supervision. Here, medics treated dehydration, burns, and shock. Women were provided food, water, and, when possible, interpreters. The United States military recorded each case carefully, noting those separated from families and those requiring further psychological care. American records from the 27th Infantry Division and 2nd Marine Division confirm that dozens of Japanese women clung to rescuing soldiers, refusing separation. Their reactions were seen as a direct result of imperial propaganda and wartime trauma. Many were convinced that if left on their own, they would be killed, either by Americans or by vengeful Japanese soldiers who believed surrender dishonored the emperor. As U.S. forces advanced across the Pacific, Saipan became a crucial staging ground. Civilians from the island were gradually housed in temporary camps, where they would remain until the war's end. These were not POW camps like those used for enemy soldiers. They were controlled humanitarian zones. However, conditions remained harsh: overcrowded tents, limited resources, fear of the unknown future. Japan's capitulation in August 1945 triggered the slow and complicated process of repatriation. Many Saipan civilians, including women once evacuated under U.S. care, were eventually returned to Japanese-administered territories. But documentation is fragmented. Countless personal stories, especially those of women, disappeared into silence. The Marine who took her hand that day filed a brief report noting a civilian female who refused separation. Soldiers rarely learned what became of the individuals they helped. Their paths crossed violently and briefly, then diverged into history's shadows. Surviving witnesses recall her type clearly, even if names are lost. A woman who held on to the only person left in a world of fear. The war had ripped apart identities and loyalties. Yet in that moment, recorded only in simple lines of military paperwork, one truth shined through. For a few critical hours on Saipan, a Marine's compassion was stronger than terror. And even as the island rebuilt, and the world prepared for Japan's final battles, human stories like theirs remained the quiet aftermath of a merciless war. Fragile, undocumented, but deeply real. For years after the war, Maria and those like her lived in a kind of suspended silence. When they were finally repatriated to Germany in 1946-47, many expected hugs, celebration, a return to normal life. Instead, thousands of women POWs found their homeland in ruins. Cities bombed flat, the nation disgraced, poverty everywhere. And worst of all, their own returning communities saw them not as survivors, but as symbols of shame. Rumors spread that any German woman held overseas must have been degraded, must have compromised herself to survive. Relationships with American guards, even when consensual, even when life-saving, became accusations whispered behind closed doors. Many women hid their experiences, some refusing to ever speak of Texas again. Their love stories, if one can call them that, were sealed away like classified files. American veterans faced their own silence. Having felt sympathy for the enemy was an uncomfortable truth in the post-war narrative. In the United States, memories of laughter shared through a fence were replaced by parades, medals, and the pressure to move on. Maria's son would later say that she slept lightly all her life, waking at the slightest sound. She smiled often, but the ache in her eyes betrayed the years when her fate depended on the command of strangers across an ocean. She never forgot the guard who did not let go. Historians today are finally piecing together what official reports did not capture, that compassion quietly survived inside a global war designed to extinguish it. In the archives of Camp Hearn and Camp Huntsville, letters long confiscated revealed tenderness written in forbidden ink. "I will wait for you. Don't forget me. I am not your enemy." These were human pleas struggling to exist between nations that insisted they must hate each other. Maria lived a long life. She married, raised children, and rarely mentioned the war, except for one detail she kept until old age. On the night before she died, she told her granddaughter, "A soldier once held my hand so tightly because he knew letting go might kill me." No further explanation, just that memory, suspended, fragile, and profoundly human. Her story, and those like it, remind us of a truth often missing from war documentaries. Even in captivity, even across barbed wire, people did not stop being human. They did not stop loving. War is remembered through statistics. Millions captured, millions lost, millions displaced. Yet the true weight of history lies not in numbers, but in the fragile decisions made by individuals who refused to surrender their humanity. In a world designed to separate us from them, one woman's refusal to let go, and one soldier's decision to hold on, exposes a truth that battlefields cannot erase. The enemy is often just a stranger who also wants to live. Maria's story does not appear in textbooks or military reports. It survives only in whispers, in faded photographs, in the trembling voice of a granddaughter remembering her grandmother's final confession. But through stories like hers, we glimpse a side of war too easily buried. Compassion found not after peace, but in the very heart of fear. Somewhere in Texas, the prairie winds still sweep across rusted fence posts, the last remnants of a camp where prisoners waited and guards watched. And perhaps, if one stands quietly enough, the ghost of that night lingers. A young woman clinging to a soldier's sleeve, terrified of the silence beyond the wire, and a heartbeat later, the warmth of a hand refusing to betray her to the darkness. War separated them. Humanity connected them. And that history should never forget.